Okay, let's be real for a second. BTS is not just a boy group. They're a phenomenon. A cultural earthquake. 7 guys who somehow managed to sell out stadiums on every single continent, break Billboard records that had been standing for decades, and make millions of people around the world cry, laugh, and feel genuinely seen, all at the same time. ARMY knows their discography by heart, knows their choreography by frame, knows their birthdays, their shoe sizes, their favorite ramen flavors. But here's the thing, there's one chapter of BTS story that even the most dedicated ARMY might not fully know. And that chapter? It's called love. Or more precisely, the rules around love. Because being in BTS doesn't just mean you're famous. It means you live inside a system. A system with unspoken codes, industry pressure, fan expectations, and management decisions that shape literally every part of your life, including who you can love, how you can love them, and whether anyone is ever allowed to know. So here's the big question. What actually happens when one of the most famous men on the planet wants to fall in love? What are the rules they follow? What are the sacrifices they make? And which member's story will actually break your heart the most? Stay with us, because this list goes deeper than you think. Number 7. Jin's Invisible Girlfriend Era, the rule of total silence. So let's start with the oldest member, Kim Seokjin. Jin, the guy who calls himself worldwide handsome with zero irony and somehow gets away with it because honestly, he's not wrong. Jin has always been the member who carries this warm, almost paternal energy within BTS, the one who cooks for the members, who laughs the loudest, who makes everyone feel like everything's going to be okay. But behind that giant windshield wiper laugh and those dad jokes that make you groan and smile at the same time, Jin has been living by one of the harshest unspoken rules in the entire K-pop industry, and that rule is this: total, absolute, suffocating silence about your romantic life. Not keep it private. Not don't overshare. We're talking about a level of silence so complete that for years, millions of people genuinely debated whether Jin had ever been in a relationship at all. And the wild part? That silence wasn't just a personal choice. It was a system. A carefully constructed wall built from industry expectations, fan culture psychology, and the very specific economics of how K-pop idols are packaged and sold to the world. Let's break this down properly, because the backstory here is actually insane. When HYB, then still Big Hit Entertainment, was building BTS in the early 2010s, they were operating in a K-pop landscape that had very clear, very brutal rules about idol dating. The industry logic was simple and cold. Fans buy into idols partly through parasocial fantasy. The idea, even if it's never stated out loud, that the idol is emotionally available. That their affection, their attention, their love songs are directed at you, the fan. The moment an idol is confirmed to be in a relationship, that parasocial bubble pops. And when the bubble pops, sales drop, fan communities fracture, and careers can genuinely collapse overnight. This wasn't theoretical. This was documented history across dozens of K-pop careers throughout the 2000s and 2010s. So by the time Jin debuted in 2013 as the oldest member of this brand new group, the rule was already baked into the culture he was entering. You do not talk about dating. You do not confirm relationships. You smile, you deflect, you joke about being married to the fans, and you keep moving. And Jin, being Jin, followed this rule with a kind of graceful, almost theatrical compliance that was honestly impressive to watch. Every time an interviewer asked about his ideal type, Jin would give these perfectly crafted non-answers. His ideal type changed slightly from interview to interview. Sometimes he'd say he likes someone who laughs at his jokes. Sometimes he'd say someone kind, someone who likes food, answers so general they could apply to literally anyone on the planet. It was a masterclass in saying words without saying anything. But here's where it gets really interesting and, honestly, a little heartbreaking. In 2022, right before Jin enlisted in the South Korean military, becoming the first BTS member to do so, he gave a series of interviews and fan interactions that felt different. More reflective. More honest. Like a man who knew he was about to step away from this world for a while and wanted to leave something real behind. And in those moments, Jin talked about loneliness in ways that hit differently. He talked about how the members are his family, how ARMY gives him purpose. But he also talked carefully in that very Jin way about wanting ordinary things. Wanting to just sit with someone who matters to him without cameras. Wanting a quiet life alongside the loud one. He never named anyone. He never confirmed anything. But the weight of what he wasn't saying was somehow louder than anything he could have said directly. And ARMY felt it. The fan community erupted with analysis, with theories, with emotional threads that went viral about what Jin's words really meant. Because here's the truth about the total silence rule that Jin has lived by: it doesn't make the feelings disappear. It just makes them invisible. And invisible feelings don't go away. They accumulate. They press against the walls of the silence until those walls start to vibrate. Jin has spent over a decade being one of the most recognized faces on the planet while simultaneously keeping an entire dimension of his humanity completely locked away from public view. Think about what that actually means on a daily, lived level. Every time he's at a restaurant and someone might be sitting across from him. Every time he travels and there's someone he wants to call. Every phone call, every text, every moment of connection, filtered through the awareness that if this ever gets out, it becomes a news cycle. It becomes a crisis management situation. It becomes something that affects not just him, but 6 other people and an entire company and millions of fans who have built parts of their identity around their relationship with him. The weight of that is genuinely staggering. And yet Jin carried it with this incredible lightness. With laughter. With warmth. With those terrible, wonderful dad jokes that somehow made everyone feel like the world was fine. That's the real hidden rule that Jin's story reveals. The rule of total silence isn't just about keeping secrets. It's about learning to be fully, joyfully present in public while carrying an entire private world that no one else gets to see. It's about performing happiness so well that it becomes real. And maybe, just maybe, that performance of joy is also how you survive it. Jin enlisted in December 2022. He was discharged in June 2024. And when he came back with that same enormous laugh, that same warmth, that same energy. Like the silence had held. Like the walls had stayed up. But if you watch closely, and ARMY always watches closely, there's something in his eyes now that wasn't there before. Something that's lived through more than it's saying. And that right there is the rule of total silence in its purest form. Number 6. Suga. Emotion blackout rule, when music becomes the only love letter. Yoongi. Suga. Agust D. 3 names, 1 person, and somehow each name carries a completely different emotional universe inside it. If Jin's rule was total silence, then Suga's rule is something even more complex, even more layered, and honestly, when you really sit with it, even more devastating. Because Suga didn't just stay silent about love. Suga redirected every single drop of romantic and emotional energy he had into his music. And the result? Some of the most raw, most painfully honest songwriting in modern pop history. But also a man who, for years, essentially disappeared behind his own art. A man who used music so completely as an emotional outlet that the line between Yoongi the artist and Yoongi the human being who needs love became almost impossible to see. Let's go back to the beginning, because context here is everything. Yoongi grew up in Daegu, a city in South Korea that's known for being a little rougher around the edges than Seoul, a city that produces people with a certain grit, a certain directness, a certain refusal to perform emotions they don't actually feel. Yoongi has talked in interviews about how his family wasn't financially comfortable, about how he slept in a studio smaller than most people's bathrooms, about how he worked part-time jobs to keep himself alive while pursuing music in a system that told him repeatedly he wasn't the right type, the right look, the right package for what K-pop wanted. He fought for every single inch of his career. And that fight, that years-long battle to be taken seriously as an artist, shaped something fundamental in how Yoongi relates to emotions. Because when you spend your formative years in survival mode, when every resource you have goes into just staying in the game, you don't have a lot of bandwidth left for romantic vulnerability. You learn to compress your feelings. To take everything messy and overwhelming and human and channel it into something structured, something controlled, something you can shape with your hands. For Yoongi, that something was always music. Now here's where this becomes relevant to the hidden dating rules conversation, because what Yoongi did, consciously or not, was develop what we can only describe as an emotion blackout strategy. On the surface, in interviews, in public appearances, Yoongi is famously the member who seems least interested in talking about feelings. He's dry. He's deadpan. He's the guy who will sit in a group setting while everyone else is being dramatically emotional and just stare at the camera with this expression that says, "I am too tired and too intelligent for this conversation." Fans love him for it. The Min Yoongi doesn't care meme has been running for years. But here's the thing that makes this so much more complicated than it looks. Yoongi cares more than almost anyone. You can hear it in every single song he writes. You can hear it in The Last, his underground track where he rapped with brutal, clinical honesty about his OCD, his depression, his fear of failing, his fear of being forgotten. You can hear it in Agust D, where he tore apart every mask he'd built and laid the raw material of himself out for the world. You can hear it in Sisa, which he wrote for the Love Yourself era, a song about a relationship stuck in painful imbalance that hits so specifically, so emotionally precisely, that it's hard to believe it came from someone who doesn't do feelings. The emotion blackout rule is this: in public, lock it down completely. No relationship hints. No soft admissions. No romantic vulnerability in interviews or fan interactions. But in music, everything is allowed. Everything is fair game. The music becomes the one space where Yoongi can be completely honest about longing, about love, about loss, about the specific ache of wanting connection while being terrified of it. And because the music exists in this slightly removed, artistic space, because fans can argue about whether a lyric is autobiographical or fictional, it gives Yoongi plausible deniability. He can pour his entire emotional life into a song and then sit in an interview the next day and give a 3-word answer about his ideal type. The music says everything. The man says nothing. And the gap between those two things? That gap is where the hidden rule lives. But let's go even deeper, because there's a specific moment in Suga's timeline that illustrates this rule so perfectly it almost hurts to look at directly. In 2023, as part of the Agust D solo era, Yoongi released D-Day, his third mixtape under the Agust D name, and went on a solo world tour. During that tour, during that album cycle, something shifted in how he spoke about his life. He talked about therapy. He talked about learning, slowly and painfully, to let people in. He talked about the members of BTS as the relationships that kept him grounded. And in one particularly striking moment, during a live stream with fans, he said something that the ARMY community immediately clipped and shared thousands of times. He talked about how he used to think that being needed by others was enough. That doing his job well, making music that helped people, being useful, that was enough of a connection. And then he paused. And he said it wasn't. That he learned, somewhere along the way, that being needed is not the same as being loved. That producing something beautiful is not the same as being seen by someone who knows you when the studio lights are off. He didn't elaborate. He moved on quickly, in classic Yoongi fashion, with a deflection and a deadpan joke. But that pause, that 2 or 3 seconds of honest stillness before the wall went back up, said more about the cost of the emotion blackout rule than any confession could have. Because here's what that rule actually does to a person over time. When you train yourself to express vulnerability only through art, you become incredibly powerful as an artist. Your music deepens. Your lyrics develop this aching specificity that resonates with millions of people because it's drawing from a real well of real feeling. But you also create a split inside yourself. A fracture between the version of you that exists in the music, open, hurting, reaching, and the version of you that exists in the world, closed, controlled, untouchable. And eventually, those two versions of yourself have to reconcile. Suga, especially post-military enlistment, having served his mandatory service and come back, seems to be in that reconciliation process now. The music is still there. The emotional precision is still there. But there's something slightly more open in recent Yoongi. A slightly wider door. Like maybe the emotion blackout rule, which served him so well for so long, is slowly, carefully being renegotiated. And that is one of the most quietly compelling stories in all of BTS history. Because it's not a scandal. It's not a confirmation or a denial. It's just a man, slowly, on his own timeline, learning that love doesn't have to only live in the music. That sometimes, maybe, it's allowed to live in real life too. Number 5. Jimin. Mirror effect rule. Love yourself before you can love anyone else. Park Jimin. The member who made an entire generation of people reconsider what it means to be soft and strong at the same time. The member whose performances don't just entertain, they communicate something. Something deep, something searching, something that feels like watching a person work through their own emotional architecture in real time, right there on stage, in front of 70,000 people. And if you followed Jimin's journey from the very beginning, from that nervous, slightly uncertain trainee who almost got cut from BTS before debut, to the man who sold out solo shows, topped global charts with like crazy, and stood on stages around the world with this quiet, unshakable presence, then you already know that Jimin's relationship with himself has always been the most complicated love story he's ever lived. And that's exactly where his hidden dating rule begins. Because Jimin's rule isn't about silence, and it isn't about emotional blackout. Jimin's rule is something far more internal, far more philosophical, and honestly, when you trace it through the timeline of his career and his public statements, far more painful to maintain. The rule is this: you cannot give real love to someone else until you've genuinely made peace with who you are. And for Jimin, making peace with who he is has been a journey so long, so difficult, so publicly documented through his music and his words, that calling it a rule almost undersells it. It's been more like a lifelong excavation. Let's go back to debut era, 2013. Jimin was the last member added to BTS, accepted into the group just months before they went public. That fact alone, being the last one in, the one who came closest to not making it, planted something inside him. A seed of insecurity that would grow quietly alongside everything else. In those early years, Jimin talked openly about his body, about not feeling good enough, about watching himself on video and seeing flaws instead of a performer. He talked about practicing longer than everyone else, staying in the studio after everyone had gone home, running the same 8 count over and over until his body was exhausted, because good enough never felt good enough. And this matters enormously to the dating rules conversation, because here's the psychological reality of what Jimin was living through in those years, when your entire internal world is organized around the question, am I enough? Romantic relationships become almost impossibly complicated. Because love, real love, healthy love, requires a certain baseline of self-acceptance. It requires being able to receive affection without immediately questioning whether you deserve it. It requires being able to say, I am worthy of this person's time and care, without your brain immediately running a counter-argument. And for years, Jimin's brain was running that counter-argument on loop. Now, the K-pop industry's standard hidden dating rule, don't confirm, don't deny, keep fans in parasocial comfort, was operating on Jimin the same way it was operating on every other member. But what makes Jimin's situation uniquely layered is that the external rule and the internal rule were essentially saying the same thing from different directions. The industry was saying you can't be in a relationship publicly because it affects your image. And Jimin's own internal voice was saying you can't be in a relationship privately because you're not ready. Both rules pointing toward the same outcome. Both rules keeping love at a distance. But here's where Jimin's story becomes genuinely extraordinary, because unlike a lot of people who live with that kind of internal conflict and just keep living with it quietly, Jimin decided to make it the subject of his art. The entire Love Yourself era of BTS, which ran from 2017 to 2019 and became one of the most commercially and critically successful periods in the group's history, was built around a concept that Jimin embodied more personally, more vulnerably than perhaps any other member. The idea that self-love isn't a destination you arrive at, it's a practice. A daily, sometimes painful, always ongoing practice of choosing to see yourself clearly and still deciding you're worth loving. Jimin performed this concept. But more than that, he lived it publicly. In interviews during that era, in V-Live broadcasts, in the documentary Burn the Stage, Jimin said things that no idol in the carefully managed world of K-pop was supposed to say. He talked about crying alone, about feeling like a burden, about looking at the other members and feeling like they were more talented, more naturally gifted, more deserving of the success they were all sharing. He said these things with this raw, almost reckless honesty, like someone who had decided that the only way through the darkness was to describe it out loud, precisely, to as many people as possible. And ARMY responded with this overwhelming wave of love and recognition, because millions of people around the world were sitting with their own versions of the same feeling. That moment, that choice to be publicly, unflinchingly honest about his internal struggle, changed something in Jimin. You can trace it through the music that followed. Filter. Lie. His solo album, Face, released in 2023, which is essentially a 40-minute document of a man confronting every mask he's ever worn and asking himself what's underneath. The title track, Like Crazy, which became the first solo Korean artist song to debut at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, is specifically about the disorientation of loving someone while not being fully sure of your own ground. About the intoxication and the terror of connection when your sense of self is still being built. The mirror effect rule, as it plays out in Jimin's story, is this. He held love at arm's length not because of industry pressure alone, though that pressure was absolutely real and absolutely present, but because somewhere deep in his understanding of himself, he knew that bringing another person into his emotional world before he'd done the work of understanding that world himself would be unfair. To them, yes, but more than that, to himself. And what makes this genuinely moving, genuinely compelling as a story, is that Jimin actually did the work. You can see it. You can see it in the difference between 2013 Jimin, nervous, self-critical, always slightly braced for rejection, and 2024 Jimin, who walks onto a stage with this calm, grounded presence that says, I know who I am and I know what I can do, and I'm not apologizing for either. The self-love journey that BTS sang about as a concept, Jimin lived as a reality. Number 4. RM. Intellectual distance rule. When your mind becomes a wall around your heart. Kim Namjoon. RM. The leader. The architect. The guy who taught himself English by watching Friends reruns and then went on to deliver a speech at the United Nations that made world leaders sit up straight and pay attention. The guy whose studio is filled with philosophy books, art catalogs, half-finished poems, and notebooks covered in thoughts that are too dense and too honest to ever make it into a pop song without being heavily edited first. Namjoon is, by almost every measure, one of the most intellectually formidable people in the entire music industry, not just K-pop, not just Korean music, but globally. His IQ has been reported at 148. He reads with the hunger of someone who genuinely believes that understanding the world better is the closest thing to a moral obligation. He visits art museums alone on his days off, not for content, not for Instagram, just because standing in front of something beautiful made by another human being fills something in him that nothing else quite reaches. And all of that extraordinary intellectual depth and emotional intelligence and philosophical sensitivity has, for most of his career, functioned as the most sophisticated, most impenetrable wall around his heart that you could possibly imagine. Because here's the thing about being the smartest person in most rooms you walk into, it gives you an almost unlimited ability to analyze your way out of vulnerability. And that is exactly what RM's hidden dating rule has been built on. The intellectual distance rule works like this. When emotions get too close, too real, too threatening to the carefully maintained equilibrium of your inner life, you think about them instead of feeling them. You contextualize them. You reference them through literature, through art, through the lens of philosophers who wrestled with the same questions centuries ago. You turn the feeling into a concept, and then you examine the concept from a safe distance, and somehow in that process the raw, overwhelming, human reality of the feeling gets managed, contained, made into something you can hold without it burning your hands. Now, before we go further, let's be absolutely clear about something. RM is not cold. He is not unfeeling. If you've watched any of the countless moments where he's broken down crying in front of ARMY, where he's spoken with trembling honesty about the pressure of being the leader, about the fear of failing the members, about the specific loneliness of carrying responsibility that no one else in the group quite shares, you know that Namjoon feels everything. He feels it so deeply that the intellectual scaffolding isn't a replacement for emotion. It's a protection from being completely consumed by it. But here's where this connects directly to the dating rules conversation in a way that is genuinely fascinating. RM has been more openly, more publicly reflective about love and relationships than almost any other BTS member, and yet, paradoxically, he is also the member who seems to keep the actual reality of romantic connection most carefully at arm's length. He'll quote Nietzsche in relation to loneliness. He'll reference a painting by Basquiat when talking about feeling misunderstood. He'll write lyrics so searingly beautiful about the experience of loving someone that fans have been trying to decode the biographical details for years. But when it comes to the actual, specific, ground-level reality of his own romantic life, the intellectual framework goes up like a force field. Let's talk about Mono, his 2018 solo mixtape, because it is the single most important document we have for understanding how RM's intellectual distance rule operates emotionally. Mono is ostensibly a playlist, Namjoon called it that himself, deliberately downplaying it to manage expectations. But what it actually is a 40-minute meditation on loneliness, connection, belonging, and the specific pain of being someone who understands the world deeply but struggles to feel at home in it. The track Forever Rain, which became the most streamed track on the project, opens with rain sounds and builds into this achingly beautiful piece about wanting to disappear into ordinariness. About wanting to just be a person walking in the rain without the weight of being seen, being known, being RM. And buried inside that longing for ordinariness is a longing for love that is so compressed, so carefully intellectualized, that you almost miss how raw it actually is. Almost. Because Namjoon is too good a writer to fully hide what he's actually saying. He just says it in a way that gives him enough distance to survive saying it. Then there's Wildflower from his 2022 solo album Indigo, which is, and I Will Die on This Hill, one of the most important albums released by any K-pop artist in the last decade. Indigo was explicitly described by Namjoon as his attempt to document who he was in his late 20s before BTS' mandatory military hiatus changed everything. It's an album about identity, about what remains when you strip away the fame, the leader role, the expectations. And running through every single track is this question: who does Kim Namjoon get to be when he's not performing being RM? Who does he love? Who loves him back? He never answers directly. But the asking, the sustained, beautiful, agonized asking, tells you everything about what the intellectual distance rule costs him. Because here's the painful irony at the center of this story. Namjoon's extraordinary intelligence, the thing that has made him such an exceptional artist, such an effective leader, such a compelling public intellectual, is also the thing that makes genuine romantic vulnerability the most difficult thing in his world. Because vulnerability, real vulnerability, requires you to stop analyzing. It requires you to put down the philosophy books and the art theory and the carefully constructed frameworks for understanding human experience and just feel something without immediately knowing what it means. And for someone whose entire relationship with the world is mediated through understanding, mediated through meaning-making, that is an almost physically uncomfortable state to be in. There's a moment, a small, almost throwaway moment, in one of BTS in the Soup episodes, where the members are just living quietly together in a beautiful natural setting, and Namjoon is sitting by the water alone. And someone asks him what he's thinking about, and he says nothing and then laughs, because the idea of him thinking about nothing is genuinely absurd and he knows it. But in that laugh, in that tiny moment of self-aware humor, there's also this flash of something wistful. Number 3. J-Hope. Sunshine Armor Rule. When happiness becomes both your gift and your prison. Young Hoseok. J-Hope. The member whose very existence in BTS feels like someone took pure kinetic energy, wrapped it in a human body, gave it a name, and said, okay, go be the emotional backbone of one of the biggest groups on the planet. The member who earned the title Hope not as a marketing decision, but as a lived reality. Because in the early years of BTS, when everything was uncertain, when the group was sleeping in cramped dorms and eating instant noodles and wondering if any of this was actually going to work, Hoseok was the one who kept the energy up, who kept the laughter alive, who walked into a room and somehow made the room feel like a better place to be just by being in it. And that extraordinary, almost supernatural capacity for joy is both the most beautiful thing about young Hoseok and the most quietly devastating thing about the hidden rule it created around his romantic life. Because when you become the happy one, when that identity gets cemented so early and so completely that it becomes load-bearing for everyone around you, you face a problem that almost nobody talks about. What happens when you're not happy? What happens when the sunshine armor, which you built to protect others, starts to feel like it's trapping you inside? And more specifically, what happens when you want to fall in love, when you want to be vulnerable and uncertain and messy in the way that real romantic connection always requires, but the role you've been assigned by your group, by your company, by tens of millions of fans who need you to be their hope, doesn't leave any room for that kind of softness? Let's build the full picture here, because Hoseok's backstory is richer and more complicated than the sunshine exterior suggests. He grew up in Gwangju, joined Big Hit as a street dancer with serious underground credentials. This was not a kid who stumbled into performance. This was someone who had been building his craft on actual streets, in actual competitions, developing a relationship with movement and with performing for crowds that was completely self-made, completely earned. He came into BTS with a work ethic that even the other members, all of whom are famously hardworking, found intimidating. And he came in with this performance identity already fully formed, high energy, audience-focused, emotionally generous to the point where his own needs become secondary to the experience of whoever is watching. That performance identity and the sunshine armor rule grew up together, reinforcing each other over years. Every time Hoseok walked on stage and the crowd erupted. Every time he carried a low-energy rehearsal back up to where it needed to be. Every time a member was struggling and Hoseok showed up with exactly the right energy to lift them, all of those moments deepened the groove of the identity, deepened the expectation, deepened the gap between the public face and whatever was happening underneath it. Now, for most of BTS' early and middle career, Hoseok played the sunshine armor role so completely, so consistently, that it was genuinely hard to see the seams. He was the member least likely to have a publicly emotional breakdown, least likely to sit in a documentary interview and talk about depression or insecurity in the raw, unfiltered way that some of the other members did. His struggles, when they surfaced at all, were referenced briefly and then quickly redirected back toward gratitude, toward positivity, toward the lessons learned rather than the pain experienced. And the fandom largely accepted this framing because it matched the image. Because J-Hope the Sunshine made sense. Because his happiness felt real, and it was real, genuinely, which made it easy to assume that the happiness was the whole story. But then 2022 happened. And Hoseok released Jack in the Box. And everything changed. Because Jack in the Box, his first official solo album, released while BTS was on hiatus, is not a sunshine record. It is not a record made by the emotional backbone of a supergroup performing joy for the comfort of millions. It is a dark, aggressive, deeply personal record that sounds like someone who has been holding something back for a very long time and finally, decided to let it out. The album artwork alone was a statement, a jack-in-the-box figure, something that looks playful on the outside and then springs out with something startling when you open it. The parallel was not subtle. Hoseok was telling you directly, I am the jack-in-the-box. I am the thing that looks like pure entertainment, but contains something more complicated, more explosive, more real than the packaging suggests. Tracks like Arson, which became one of the most talked about moments of his solo career, showed a side of Hoseok that even longtime ARMY members found disorienting at first. Aggressive, sharp, lyrically confrontational. A man burning something down deliberately and asking whether destruction can also be a form of creation. And running underneath all of it, if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the emotional subtext rather than just the sonic surface, is a love story. Or more precisely, a story about what happens to love when you've spent your entire career building a version of yourself that doesn't have space for the vulnerability love requires. The sunshine armor rule in Hoseok's dating life works like this, because his public identity is so completely organized around positive energy, around being a source of strength for others, around emotional generosity. The idea of being someone who needs something, who is uncertain, who is scared, who might not be okay, that idea creates this profound internal dissonance. Because needing someone, really needing them, means admitting that the sunshine has limits. It means saying, I am not always warm. I am not always bright. Sometimes I am cold and confused, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I need someone to sit with me in that. And for J-Hope, for the role that J-Hope represents, not just to fans but to the members, to the entire BTS ecosystem, that admission feels almost like a betrayal of the function he serves. So the rule becomes, keep the armor on. Keep the energy up. Let love exist only in the spaces where the armor can stay in place, where you can be loving without being vulnerable, where you can give warmth without needing it back in ways that might show. But here's the thing that Jack in the Box revealed, that his military enlistment and return have continued to reveal. Hoseok is done with that version of the rule. Number 2. V. Beautiful stranger rule, when you're too iconic to be loved normally. Kim Taehyung. V. The member who exists in a category so specific, so singular, that the K-pop industry genuinely doesn't have a template for him. The member whose face has been called, by fashion houses, by photographers, by people who spend their entire careers studying what makes a human face compelling, one of the most symmetrically perfect faces ever documented. The member whose aesthetic sensibility is so developed, so personal, so completely his own, that he doesn't just wear trends, he creates them. Who picks up a vintage camera and produces photographs that get exhibited in galleries. Who listens to jazz and classical music on his days off not because it's a curated personality choice, but because it genuinely moves him in ways that contemporary pop sometimes doesn't. Who named his dog Yeontan and loved that dog with a specific, tender, completely unguarded affection that somehow told you more about who Kim Taehyung really is than almost any interview ever could. V is, by almost universal consensus, inside and outside the fandom, the most visually arresting member of BTS. And that extraordinary visual presence, that face that stops people mid-thought, that quality of being almost impossibly beautiful in a way that feels both real and slightly dreamlike, is both the most obvious thing about him and the source of the most complicated, most painful hidden dating rule in this entire list. Because here is the question that V's existence raises that almost nobody asks out loud. What does it actually feel like to be so beautiful, so famous, so completely iconic, that the people who love you can never quite separate you from the image of you? What does it feel like to walk through the world knowing that most people who look at you are seeing a projection, a fantasy, a magazine cover, a music video, an idea, rather than the actual, specific, wonderfully weird human being underneath? And how do you build real love, vulnerable, ordinary, sometimes awkward, deeply human love, when the image is always standing between you and the other person? Let's build this properly, because Taehyung's story requires the full context to land the way it deserves to. He grew up in Jeocheon, a small rural town in South Gyeongsang province, and this detail matters more than people realize, because it means that the version of Kim Taehyung that exists before the fame, before the cameras, before the global icon status, is rooted in something genuinely quiet and grounded. He talks about his grandparents with a warmth that is completely unperformed. He talks about the countryside, about open space, about the specific quality of slowness that small-town life has, with a nostalgia that tells you he carries that world inside him still. And that person, the Jeocheon kid, the grandson, the boy who grew up with space and quiet and genuine human connection before the machinery of fame arrived, is the person who has been navigating what it means to be V ever since. And navigating it has not been simple. Because the beautiful stranger rule, which is what we're calling Taehyung's hidden dating dynamic, is this: when you are that level of iconic, that level of visually extraordinary, that level of globally recognized, every potential romantic connection is immediately complicated by the question of what the other person actually sees. Are they seeing you? Or are they seeing V? Are they drawn to Kim Taehyung, the jazz-loving, photography-obsessed, dog-adoring, slightly eccentric, deeply warm human being from a small town in South Korea? Or are they drawn to the idea of being with someone who looks like that? Who is that famous? Who represents that particular kind of cultural power? And here's the brutal reality. Most of the time, even Taehyung himself probably can't tell the difference. Because the image is so complete, so pervasive, so globally distributed, that it has become almost impossible to get behind it. Think about what it means to have your face on billboards in Times Square. To have your picture as the lock screen of millions of phones around the world. To walk into a room, any city, any country, and have people recognize you not just as a celebrity, but as something approaching an archetype. A face that has become, for a generation, a shorthand for a certain kind of beauty, a certain kind of cool, a certain kind of emotional expressiveness. When you are that image, when the image is that powerful, you become, in a very real psychological sense, a beautiful stranger to almost everyone you meet. Even to people who think they know you. Even to people who have watched every interview, every V Live, every behind-the-scenes moment. Because what they know is the image. And the image, no matter how carefully constructed, no matter how much of the real person it contains, is always a translation. Always slightly removed from the original. Now let's talk about the specific moment in Taehyung's public story that crystallizes this rule more clearly than anything else, and that is the period around 2022 and 2023, when reports began circulating about a possible relationship with Blackpink's Jennie. The alleged Tenny situation, which was never officially confirmed by either party, created one of the most intense, most analyzed, most emotionally charged fan responses in K-pop history. ARMY response was divided. Some fans were supportive, genuinely happy that Taehyung might have found someone. Others responded with the kind of visceral, almost territorial upset that reveals exactly how deep the parasocial investment in these artists goes. And in the middle of all of it, in the absolute eye of that social media storm, was Kim Taehyung, who said nothing, who kept posting his aesthetic photography on Instagram, who went about his life with this almost deliberate, almost defiant normalcy that somehow managed to be both a non-response and a statement at the same time. And that silence, that very specific, very considered silence, is the beautiful stranger rule in action. Because here's what Taehyung seems to understand, at a bone-deep level, that makes his approach to the dating rules conversation uniquely sophisticated. The image cannot be argued with. You cannot hold a press conference and explain to millions of people that the person they've built a fantasy around is a real human being with real needs and real feelings and a real right to love and be loved. You cannot rationalize the parasocial investment away. You cannot make people see past the beautiful stranger by telling them to. The only thing you can do, the only move that actually has any integrity, is to just live. To just be. To make your choices, privately, on your own terms, and let the image do whatever the image is going to do without letting it dictate what the human being underneath it is allowed to want. Taehyung's solo work has deepened this picture enormously. His 2023 album, Layover, which arrived with almost no promotional fanfare, no hype campaign, just a quiet release that felt like someone sliding a note under a door and walking away, is an extraordinarily intimate record. Number 1. Jungkook. Golden Cage Rule, when you grow up inside the fame and never get to fall in love first. Jungkook. The Golden Magne. The youngest. The one who joined Big Hit Entertainment at 15 years old, 15, and handed over the most formative, most vulnerable, most developmentally critical years of his entire life to the process of becoming one of the most famous human beings on the planet. Think about what 15 means. 15 is first heartbreaks. 15 is figuring out who you are when nobody's watching. 15 is making mistakes that don't have consequences beyond your immediate circle. 15 is learning, slowly and messily and beautifully, what it means to want someone and be wanted back. 15 is the beginning of the entire emotional education that most people take for granted: the dating, the awkwardness, the late-night conversations, the learning curve of loving another person without losing yourself in the process. Jungkook didn't get any of that. Not in the normal way. Not in the way that every other person reading this got to experience it. Instead, at 15, he stepped into a training system so rigorous, so all-consuming, so completely organized around the production of a perfect performer that everything else, school, friendships, family dinners, first loves, ordinary teenage fumbling, got compressed into the margins. And then, before he'd even finished growing up, before his voice had fully settled, before he'd had a single relationship that didn't exist under the microscope of public scrutiny, he was famous. Not locally famous. Not industry famous. Globally, historically, culturally famous. By the time Jungkook was 20 years old, he was performing in front of 60,000 people a night. By 22, his face was one of the most recognized on the planet. By 25, he was releasing solo music that debuted at #1 on global charts. And through all of it, through every single milestone, every sold-out show, every record broken, every boundary pushed, the question that his story keeps circling back to, keeps returning to with this quiet, persistent urgency, is the simplest and most heartbreaking question in this entire list. When did Jungkook ever get to just be a person who fell in love? The golden cage rule is this: when you grow up inside the fame, the cage and the palace become the same structure. The thing that traps you and the thing that defines you are identical. And you can't dismantle the cage without dismantling the palace. So you live in it. You furnish it beautifully. You fill it with music and performance and the love of millions of fans. And somewhere in the back of your mind, in the quietest hours, you wonder what it would have been like to build something smaller. Something that was just yours. Let's trace this through the timeline properly, because the details here matter enormously. Jungkook has, over the years, been the BTS member most frequently at the center of dating rumors, not because he's reckless, not because he's careless, but because the combination of his youth, his extraordinary magnetism, and the sheer intensity of fan attention on him has meant that every interaction he has with anyone outside the group gets analyzed with forensic precision. The tattoo artist situation. The Taehyung's female friend situation. The various Instagram follows and unfollows that sent fan communities into spiraling analysis cycles. Each one of these moments, taken individually, would be completely unremarkable in anyone else's life. A young man in his 20s having friendships, having connections, navigating the entirely normal social landscape of being a person in the world. In Jungkook's life, each one became a news event. Each one triggered a cycle of speculation, fan reaction, management silence, and then the slow, grinding return to baseline that the industry calls damage control, but which is actually just a young man's ordinary life being processed through an extraordinary machine. And here's the specific psychological weight that the Golden Cage rule places on Jungkook that it doesn't place on the older members in quite the same way. Jin, Suga, RM, J-Hope, Jimin, V, they all had at least some years of ordinary life before the fame arrived. Some years of being anonymous, of being a regular person with regular problems and regular teenage experiences. Those years created a foundation. A memory of what ordinary felt like. A reference point for the self that existed before the machine. Jungkook doesn't have that foundation. Not really. His entire adult emotional architecture was built inside the fame. Which means that when it comes to love, to the specific vulnerability and uncertainty and beautiful messiness of romantic connection, Jungkook is working without a blueprint that was constructed in ordinary conditions. He's trying to figure out, in real time, what it means to love and be loved as a private person, when he has never actually been a private person. When his entire experience of other people has been mediated, to some degree, by what those people know him as. Think about how profoundly disorienting that actually is. Every person Jungkook meets already has a version of him in their head before they say a single word to him. Every potential connection starts with this enormous asymmetry. They know everything about him, or think they do, and he knows nothing about them. And the version of him they know isn't wrong, exactly. It's not a lie, but it's a performance version, a curated version, a version that has been shaped by years of media management and artistic construction, and the specific demands of being an idol. The real Jungkook, the one who apparently cries at movies, who is obsessed with working out with an intensity that his members find alarming, who can't sleep without the TV on, who has this very specific and very endearing habit of getting completely consumed by whatever his current interest is, whether that's photography or painting or cooking or bungee jumping, that Jungkook exists underneath all the layers. But getting to him requires penetrating layers that were installed before he was old enough to choose them. His 2023 solo album, Golden, and particularly the single, Standing Next to You, and the more vulnerable tracks like Too Sad to Dance and Hate You, gave the clearest public window yet into what the Golden Cage rule actually costs him emotionally. Too Sad to Dance, especially a slow, piano-led track about being in a crowd and feeling completely alone, about missing someone, about the specific ache of wanting connection so badly that public spaces become painful. Hit with a specificity that felt deeply biographical. Not because Jungkook said it was, but because the emotion in his vocal performance was so unguarded, so rawly present, that it didn't sound like acting. It sounded like memory. Like someone singing about something they actually knew. Okay, let's land this plane. Because after everything we've just walked through, 7 members, 7 rules, 7 completely different and completely devastating ways of navigating love inside a machine that was never designed to leave room for it, there's one thing that ties every single story together. And that thing is this. None of these rules were chosen freely. Not really. Jin's total silence wasn't a personality trait, it was a survival strategy inside an industry that punishes romantic honesty with career consequences. Suga's emotion blackout wasn't coldness, it was a man who learned to compress everything overwhelming into art, because that was the only container strong enough to hold it. Jimin's mirror effect wasn't selfishness, it was a person who understood, at some deep level, that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and who spent years trying to fill his own before he could offer it to someone else. RM's intellectual distance wasn't arrogance, it was the most intelligent person in most rooms he walked into using that intelligence as a shield against the one thing intelligence can't fully explain or control. J-Hope's sunshine armor wasn't performance, it was a man who became so good at generating warmth for others that he forgot, for a long time, that he was also allowed to receive it. V's beautiful stranger rule wasn't vanity, it was someone so completely seen by the world that being truly known by even one person became the rarest, most precious thing he could imagine. And Jungkook's golden cage wasn't weakness, it was the inevitable consequence of growing up inside the fame, of having the most formative years of your emotional life shaped by extraordinary circumstances that no 15-year-old should have to navigate. 7 rules. 7 men. One shared reality, that loving and being loved, in the way that every human being deserves, has been the quiet, persistent, beautiful struggle running underneath every song, every performance, every sold-out stadium show that BTS has ever delivered. And maybe that's the most important thing this list leaves you with. Not the rules themselves, but what the rules reveal. That these 7 people, despite everything, despite the fame and the pressure and the industry machinery and the millions of eyes watching every move, have never stopped wanting what every human being wants. To be seen. To be known. To be loved not as an icon, but as a person. They gave the world love yourself as a message. But behind the scenes, quietly, imperfectly, on their own impossible timelines, they've been trying to learn it themselves. And that journey, messy, hidden, ongoing, might just be the greatest love story BTS has ever told.